Hi, welcome to the video. Today we'll be discussing arguments made by this guy. The channel is Capturing Christianity, if you want to check out the video. His name is Cameron and I'll be addressing this video to him. Hi Cameron. I recently watched a video response you made to Neil deGrasse Tyson where you presented what you considered to be evidence for God. I finally got around to responding to it. There are some arguments you made at the end of your video that I didn't quite get to though. I will start with some smaller arguments you made before I give my response to the three evidences you presented. The first item that needs to be addressed is the mistaken idea that arguments count as evidence. Arguments of a philosophical nature are merely thoughts about concepts in a logical manner to ensure that there is consistency. They do not provide evidence in and of themselves to a discussion about empirical reality. So when a scientist or atheist asks for evidence, we are looking for actual evidence that can be verified in some real sense. Philosophy doesn't have any mechanism to actually achieve this for the most part, and so essentially we mean scientific evidence. So no matter how familiar someone is with philosophical arguments for God over the past 1,000 years, it doesn't get you any closer to evidence for God. You also made a strange assertion that we should provide evidence that there is no evidence for God. This makes no sense to say we should provide evidence that there is no evidence for unicorns, or Zeus, or flying spaghetti monsters, etc. Imagine a theist claiming there was no evidence for the flying spaghetti monster, and then I declare they need to provide evidence of that. That is completely backwards thinking. I'm the one that needs to provide evidence for the positive claim. Let's take, for example, a fairly extreme position of a small number of Christians that say there is no evidence for evolution. Now clearly, in this instance, there is overwhelming evidence for evolution, but the Christian is an ultimate skeptic or perhaps ultimately ignorant. Even in this case, we would not ask the Christian to provide evidence that there was no evidence. We would simply have to lay out the evidence to them in a more understandable manner. You then took Neil up on his challenge to provide evidence for God, and you listed three arguments. And I will be charitable here and say you are simply laying out your evidence in a more understandable manner for us. The first argument we make is the existence of dependent things. Now, I think the title of this argument is misapplied, since dependent things simply existing does not provide evidence for a God. You then said there cannot be an outside explanation of everything that exists. That's actually impossible. Now, I could be mistaken here, but isn't that what God is? An outside explanation of everything that you just claimed is impossible? Unless your statement is simply saying that things that don't exist cannot produce things that do exist, which is just obvious. You then proposed a few bizarre analogies, something about brick houses from water, and grouping many cameras together don't make the group independent. Not sure how any of that is relevant, but you then got on to explaining the problem of dependence. And the solution is that it all stems from something that is independent, which makes sense. You then claim this necessary independent thing is perfect, a term that brings us back to you not making any sense. There is no reason or evidence at all to suggest in any way that this foundation is perfect. It is a completely pointless term to use. And that's it. That is the end of your first evidence for God. You simply move on to the second argument. That took less than 2 minutes. Do you honestly believe that this is sufficient evidence for God that not only a scientist like Neil should accept, but that anyone should accept? All this argument says, unless there are simply dependent things going back for eternity, is that an independent thing produced a series of dependent things. Or perhaps a group of independent things that, as soon as they interact with one another, starts a chain reaction to produce a whole bunch of dependent things. This sounds like Big Bang cosmology and quantum mechanics to me. If you posit a God to fill this gap, then you're simply jumping to your conclusion. Well, let's look to your second evidence of fine-tuning of the universe for life. There are too many assumptions and not enough evidence that go into the fine-tuning argument that render it completely useless. The first assumption is that by playing around with mathematical constants, it somehow makes some significant point. I do think, however, that scientific inquiries into models of possible universes is worthwhile, as it may provide insights into many aspects of reality. However, changing mathematical parameters in a model does not mean that the actual constants in reality can be different to what they are, essentially making the constants a necessary aspect of the universe. For instance, if the gravitational constant was 6.674 times 10 to the negative 11, and we knew that it had to be exactly that number and could not be any other variable, and of course assuming the model is accurate, all this would mean is that it is a fact that this number is the gravitational constant, in the same way that a particle that has one proton and one electron we call hydrogen. So when we look at a periodic table and we see the numbers of protons and electrons increasing, and then we have a bunch of isotopes that branch off from that in a kind of family tree, it appears to be a very simple natural process. It's called periodicity, similar to fractals or any other mathematical pattern in the environment. In the same way, the space-time gravitational field that bends due to planets and other objects has that constant due to its very structure. Now, it could be possible that space could have a different shape in other universes, which may cause the constant to be different, but this is pure speculation and shows the lack of evidential support for fine-tuning. This isn't really a slight against fine-tuning necessarily. There are many scientific ideas that seem impossible to gather evidence, such as many universes or many dimensions. But fine-tuning for life appears to be one of those claims that cannot gather actual evidence of its mechanisms and is therefore also unfalsifiable. One consideration is the conditions necessary for life to exist are completely unknown. It may be that if a universe had even 10% of the periodic table, it could produce complex life forms. Another point is that of all possible universes, only a small percentage of those would produce conscious life forms, once all the calculations are complete. But this is true of almost everything. If we take all possible things and compare them to all actual things, the actual things are going to be a small percentage of the total. I mean, if you take all the matter in the universe, including all the galaxies, stars, and planets, take them to be about 5% of the total content of the universe, and then determine what the percentage would be for conscious life forms out of that 5%, that percentage is already going to be so incredibly small. To then say we should increase the amount of possible universes by adjusting these constants in all manner of ways. Of course, the outcome is going to show a small amount of universes that are capable of producing conscious beings. The same argument can be made towards the Goldilocks atmosphere of Earth to support life, or the distance from the Sun, or our position within the galaxy. These are all examples of fine-tuning for life. These examples are not used as evidence that there is a God, like they used to, before we gathered more information about them. In fact, these examples have been understood to be that life is actually fine-tuned for the universe. So when you position your argument to be fine-tuned for life, it seems to be opposed to what we already have uncovered. Your argument is targeting conditions that we have far less information about, and declaring this to be evidence of a being that lives outside of space and time. Essentially, it's a God of the gaps argument. Again, do you honestly believe that this is evidence for a God that a scientist or anyone should accept? I think the best any theist can claim in regards to the fine-tuning is that it does not disprove the existence of God. I think this is a good time to discuss why and when a theist would count something as evidence for God. Thankfully, you give us this standard of evidence. Quote, "The reason that this is evidence of theism is that it is not so unlikely or improbable that a good God would create a universe that can support life. Note that in your evidence to support your God, you are using God to support your evidence. This is circular reasoning, and I see this argument a lot from theists. In the resurrection arguments, for example, the evidence for God is the resurrection, and the evidence for the resurrection is God and his desire to raise Jesus from the dead. You also claim that it's like fingerprint evidence for God, but this implies the existence of metaphorical fingers that contain a relatively unique fingerprint. There is nothing at all that we can equate this to with a fingerprint for God. Not only that, but you are determining the probability of actions that may be taken by a being we don't have any way of determining the probability for. What is the probability of a unicorn flying over the rainbow given the existence of rainbows? The way probability works is by having information about the parameters. The reason that you can use an example like a poker game is because we know all the possible outcomes. We know all the cards in the set and how many cards are drawn. We do not even have all the parameters from the scientific fine-tuning calculations to know what universes are actually possible and what ranges of these constants are viable, let alone the parameters of beings that exist outside of space and time and the actions that those creatures may take. It's like determining the probability of a winning hand when the amount of cards in the deck are completely unknown and the cards themselves are blank. Fine-tuning for life does not count as evidence for God. Let's compare this to string theory. It has mathematical and structural models that solve some problems in other theoretical models. It posits several dimensional shapes that can be calculated. Overall, it appears to be a more fleshed out hypothesis than God, and yet we can still say that there is no evidence for it. Let us move to your third argument about the existence of moral knowledge. Now, this is actually a strange argument that I don't think I've heard before. It seems to assume that there are objective moral facts to begin with, and that humans' general ideas about morality actually coincide with those facts. Your argument seems to be that this would be unlikely under naturalism, that an evolutionary process would not be able to guide conscious beings to be able to understand what the facts are. Now, if I grant your premise here, I completely disagree. If there actually were moral facts, then these facts would be uncoverable in the same way that other facts about reality have been uncovered, such as scientific facts. Moral facts are not some abstract thing completely separate from reality. It deals with the very real nature of actions and consequences, pain and suffering that is inflicted upon humans, and how they will adapt to such things over time. So to say that humans that evolved within this reality would have no compass or mechanisms to determine what was morally accurate seems to go against what we already understand. Your quote from Charles Darwin is also incorrect then. The amount of things that would need to change in order to be precisely the same conditions as hive bees, the resulting creatures would no longer be human. In fact, I highly doubt that it could even be that we could even reach such an impossible outcome given our starting position. Therefore, it's such an extreme case that Darwin himself even recognizes. You bring up your discussion with Eric Willenberg and his claim that he believed in objective moral facts. He's essentially a moral realist. But his arguments for these facts are purely intuition. He just simply believes it due to its strong emotional appeal. If the only evidence we have to go on that these are objective moral facts is intuition, then these facts are actually subjective by definition. You then mentioned Sharon Street's paper against realist theories of value. Now, this is incredibly bizarre, as she is arguing for anti-realism, arguing that there are no objective moral facts. Her paper directly argues against philosophers like Eric, and directly against your argument, and yet you are citing her paper in ways that don't align with her position. You conclude that it is extremely unlikely that unguided evolution would just happen to produce beings with the correct set of moral beliefs. I disagree with this argument and your use of the term unguided, since evolution is guided by natural selection. Seems a little misleading. I think that natural selection easily accounts for humans knowing objective moral facts if they existed, although I do not think they do exist, at least not in the same way that you do. Once again, you move to the template of under theism, it's not so unlikely that a good God would want to create things with reliable beliefs about morality. We heard this exact same fallacious argument just a few minutes earlier. I will at least give you credit for being consistent. Even so, this highlights some serious flaws in your reasoning that probably need to be addressed with better epistemology. I don't intend to be patronizing here, but a good start would be to read Sharon Street's paper, along with some more recent papers on this topic. Well, these are your three evidences for the existence of a bodiless mind with all the other unbelievable attributes. Hopefully I've shown why these arguments fail to rise to the level that we would consider evidence. You brought up another interesting topic, which is the idea that the God concept, is an incredibly simple hypothesis. Your idea of perfect being theism, something that posits one being and one property, certainly sounds simple on its face, but it really isn't. The concept of perfection is so outlandish and alien, and with no real-world examples of such a thing, makes it seem less likely to me than an imperfect God. One definition of perfect is that it is complete. It could not be any better than it is. It requires no additional components. But this would mean God would not create the universe, as it is not required. Whatever the definition used, anything that has the property of perfection is going to be the most complex thing in existence. The universe itself doesn't even have that property. The other part of your simple concept is a being that has a mind without a brain and is more intelligent than all humans combined. It resides outside of space and time. It knows everything, past and future, and is capable of creating and some claim sustaining at least one universe. There is not one aspect of this concept that is simple. Your idea of what makes something simple is essentially using the least amount of words to explain what you mean. But that is not at all what simplicity means in science or by Occam's razor. The theory is simplest by having the least amount of ad hoc assumptions. It appeals to known entities rather than inferences to unknown entities, and it should be based on things that can be perceived by our senses or scientific instruments so that it can be tested and therefore be falsifiable. The perfect being hypothesis fails on all of these metrics. You compared God to the multiverse hypothesis, but the multiverse is actually simpler since it's just more universes, and we already know they exist. There are quite a few models proposed as to how these other universes form, such as simultaneously or cyclical. Even still, the multiverse hypothesis fails on many of the simplicity metrics, and similar to string theory, it has no evidence in its favor, and finding evidence for it seems almost impossible. You then brought up some tactics used by atheists like the flying spaghetti monster and supercomputers, and comparing them to God. But these arguments aren't used seriously to suggest if we give the object more power, it becomes more simple. These arguments are purely designed to mock the God hypothesis. It's a way of saying that anyone can just make up amazing attributes of anything ad hoc and have it be responsible for the entire universe. Both hypothesis, God and supercomputer, have the same evidential support, which is to say, none. You have completely misunderstood this argument, and in fact it's giving a computer more and more properties to become closer to God, meaning that it's becoming more and more complex. We're not taking away properties as you claim. It is the complete opposite. We start with something simple, like a bowl of spaghetti, and we start giving it more properties one after another, like self-awareness, the ability to fly or teleport, knowledge of all things, etc., etc., until we get to it being the creator of the universe. Your argument is incredibly disingenuous and shows just how far theists will go to twist the truth in order to make their God hypothesis into a simple being. Again, I'm not sure where you're getting these ideas from, but it seems your epistemology, your bias or lack of understanding are making you draw conclusions that are the complete opposite of reality. For someone that is meant to be exposing the intellectual side of Christianity, some of the arguments you make and the guests you have on demonstrate you clearly have a long way to go. I do appreciate the channel though. You have introduced me to seemingly serious explorers of truth, such as Inspiring Philosophy, Josh Rasmussen, Liz Jackson, and even fellow Aussies like Luke Barnes. Keep up the good work, and I have faith that you will get even better over time. Well, I hope that clears up the discussion on the supposed evidence for God. If you have any questions, then I'm sure you can find a way to ask them. Thank you for your time.